Gideon Bramwell dropped the coins onto the kitchen table one by one, slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he wants you to count each one and feel grateful for it. 7 coins. Maren Dallow stood with her hands still wet from the wash basin, watching him lay out what he called her wages for the month. 7 coins for 30 days of cooking, cleaning, hauling water before dawn, tending the chickens, mending fences, teaching his children their letters when she could barely afford candle stub enough to do it. She didn't say anything yet. She had learned in 3 years on this farm that speaking too quickly only gave Gideon something to knock back down. "That's generous," he said, and he looked her straight in the eye when he said it. Considering. That one word carried everything he had over her, and they both knew it. Maren picked up the coins without counting them. Her fingers were cracked at the knuckles from cold water and rough work. "It's not enough to rent a room in town," she said. "We both know that." Gideon leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under him. He was a heavy-set man with a short beard going gray at the edges, and he had his brother's eyes, Silas's eyes except that where Silas's had been easy, Gideon's were always calculating, always arriving somewhere ahead of you. "You're welcome to go find out," he said. "Door's right there. But if you walk through it, you walk out with nothing, and everybody in Red Willow Basin is going to wonder why Silas Bramwell's widow can't even keep a roof over her own head." She wasn't a widow. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Maren pressed her thumb against the edge of the coins in her palm until it hurt, because if she didn't do something with her hands, she was going to put them somewhere she couldn't take back. She set the coins in her apron pocket and walked outside. If this story already has you leaning forward, wondering how a woman this strong ended up trapped this long, then you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. So subscribe right now so you never miss a story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with us, because what happens next is only the beginning. The morning Calder Voss first saw Maren Dallow, he almost rode past her. He was cutting through the back of the Bramwell property because the main road had turned to mud 2 days after a late snow, and the shortcut saved him nearly a mile. He wasn't looking for anything. He was thinking about a grazing agreement he needed to finalize with the double hook outfit before week's end, and about the particular awkwardness of the dinner he had agreed to attend at the Harrowell house the following Friday, and about whether he had made the worst or the second worst decision of his adult life by agreeing to court Lenora Harrowell at all. Then he heard her voice. It stopped him the way a hawk stopping midair stops you, not because of the sounds itself, but because of what it meant. Something was paying attention out there. She was standing in the yard beside the low rail fence that separated the chickens from the kitchen garden, and she had 4 children arranged in front of her in a rough half-circle, the oldest maybe 10 and the youngest no more than 6. They were not Bramwell children. Calder knew the Bramwell children by sight, and these were not them. 2 of the 4 were barefoot despite the cold ground, and all of them were watching her with the kind of focus that children reserve for things they are genuinely interested in. Not performed attention, not the glassy patience of a schoolroom, but real watching. She was holding a flat piece of wood with something chalked on it, and she was saying, slowly and clearly, "Say it again." Not the letter, the sound. One of the boys, 7, maybe 8, with his hair pushed sideways by sleep and not yet corrected, screwed up his face and tried again. Whatever he produced made the girl beside him press her lips together, hard to keep from laughing. Maren didn't laugh. She didn't correct him sharply either. She tilted her head very slightly and said, "Closer than yesterday." That was all, and the boy straightened up a little. Calder sat his horse at the fence line and didn't announce himself. He told himself it was because he didn't want to interrupt. That was part of it. But the other part was that he didn't quite understand what he was looking at, and he wanted another minute to understand it. She was plainly dressed in the way that meant there was no money for anything else. A dark wool skirt that had been let down, and then hemmed twice at least. A gray blouse so washed it had gone the color of river fog. Her hair was dark and pinned back, practical, not decorative. She was not a young girl. She was a woman who had been doing difficult things for long enough that it had settled into her posture, not defeat, nothing like defeat, but a kind of permanent readiness, like she expected the next hard thing and had already made her peace with showing up for it. The chickens moved around the children's feet, and nobody paid them any mind. When the lesson ended because the sun had moved, and she looked at it and made a decision. The children scattered with the contained energy of animals released. Maren crouched down and picked up the chalkboard from where she'd propped it against the fence and brushed it off with the edge of her apron. She looked up and saw him. She didn't startle exactly. She went very still, and then she stood, and her expression was the expression of someone recalculating quickly, without letting it show on their face. "I'm sorry," Calder said, because it seemed like the right thing to open with. "I wasn't trying to spy. I'm cutting through to the East Road." She looked at his horse, then back at him. "You're Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. "Calder Voss," he said. He touched his hat. "You're Maren," she said, and left the last name off, which he noticed. He nodded toward where the children had gone. "Early for school." "There isn't a school," she said. "Not a real one. So it's early for whatever this is." She said it plainly, without self-pity and without pride either, just as information. Then she tucked the chalkboard under her arm and started back toward the house, without saying goodbye, which was not rude so much as honest. They were strangers. He had nothing more to say to her, and she had work to get back to. Calder sat his horse for another moment. Then he turned toward the East Road. He thought about her for 3 miles without meaning to. He had agreed to marry Lenora Harrowell in February, which meant he'd had about 2 months to get used to the idea, and had not quite managed it. That wasn't Lenora's fault. She was a capable woman, handsome, in a composed, self-possessed way, smart about land and cattle, and the complex social arithmetic of a territory where reputation was sometimes worth more than water rights. She'd inherited High Mesa Ranch from her father, run it through a difficult decade without losing it, and knew the difference between a good breeding bull and a mediocre one. These were things Calder genuinely respected. The trouble was that when he sat across from her at supper and talked about the grazing agreement or the spring fencing or the drought predictions that had half the basin worried, he felt like he was talking to a business partner, which was, technically, what she was going to be. He kept telling himself that was enough. His father had been a man of great passions and terrible judgment, and every catastrophic thing Voss Sr. had ever done had come from following his gut instead of his head. Calder had spent 15 years trying to be the opposite of that. So, a practical arrangement, complementary properties, combined water rights, a respected family name attached to his. He told himself it was sensible. He told himself it most of the way home. The general store in Red Willow Basin was run by a man named Arlen Cope, who had opinions about everything and kept them mostly to himself, which was how he'd managed to stay in business for 20 years, while the rest of the territory changed hands and allegiances around him. Calder went in 3 days after the shortcut ride to pick up a part he'd ordered for the pump, and while Arlen was hunting for it in the back, Calder leaned against the counter and looked at the ledger sitting open on the near end. He wasn't reading it on purpose, but his eye caught the column of names, and his eye caught one that stopped him. Bramwell Eggs 3 dozen credit applied to account. Credit applied to account. Not paid out. Applied to account. Meaning, whatever the eggs were worth went against the household bill at the store, not into the woman's hand. Arlen came back with the pump part and set it on the counter and named the price. "Arlen," Calder said. "That Bramwell account, the M. Is that a Bramwell woman?" Or Arlen glanced at the ledger without much interest. "That's the woman that lives out there. Maren something. She brings eggs most weeks." He pulled the ledger closed. "Gideon keeps the credit on the household account. Not hers separately. She know that?" Arlen looked at him. "I expect she does," he said, and his tone suggested that this was not something he had considered his problem. Calder paid for the pump part and went back to his horse. He stood outside in the cold for a minute before he mounted, working through something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't outrage exactly. It was the specific discomfort of a man who has just seen something clearly that he has been looking at sideways for a while and pretending he hadn't noticed. The eggs went to the household account. The 7 children's lessons happened at dawn before the chickens were fed. Her name was Maren something. He started noticing after that. He wasn't looking for her. He had a ranch to run and a courtship to manage and a grazing agreement to finalize. But Red Willow Basin was not a large place, and once you've looked at something once, you keep seeing it. He saw her at the community supper the Presbyterians put together in March. carrying a pot that looked heavy enough to require 2 hands, but she was managing it with one, because the other was steadying a stack of bowls that someone had balanced badly. He saw her eat standing up, after the tables had cleared, eating what was left of something that had mostly been finished. Not because there wasn't space to sit, because the only people still eating were the men who'd stayed for a second plate, and sitting down among them would have required one of them to acknowledge her, and none of them appeared inclined to. He saw her at the mill, waiting behind 3 men who had each arrived after her, watching all 3 of them step in front of her, without any one of them appearing to notice they'd done it. He saw her, once, through the window of the abandoned tack shed on the south edge of town at 6:30 in the morning, with a candle on a barrel head and 6 children around her, and the chalkboard propped against a rusting harness hook. And he stopped his horse and watched for 4 minutes and then made himself go on, because standing outside someone's window was not acceptable behavior, regardless of the reason. The 4th time he saw her in town a Tuesday, spitting rain, her without an umbrella, he made himself stop and think about why he kept noticing her. It wasn't that she was beautiful, though she had a face worth looking at. It wasn't pity, though what he was observing warranted it. It was something else. Something about the way she moved through spaces that had already decided she didn't matter much, with a posture that refused to agree. He asked about her carefully, and what he found out was worse than what he'd seen. He asked Dora Finch first, because Dora was the doctor's wife and knew everything about everyone's circumstances without appearing to pry. He asked it as a casual question, the kind of question you ask when you're just making conversation, and Dora gave him a long look that said she wasn't fooled but answered him anyway. Silas Bramwell's woman, Dora said. They lived together as man and wife for 2 years before he died. Fever 3 winters ago. They were married? Dora hesitated. That was always a little unclear. He pressed gently, and what came out was this. There had been a minister, a traveling one, who had come through in the summer of '83 and performed ceremonies for 3 couples in the basin who didn't have the time or the money to get to the county seat. 2 of those marriages were later recorded properly. The 3rd, Silas's and Maren's, was not, because 6 months later someone looked into it and found that the minister in question had no proper ordination, which meant he had no legal authority to marry anyone. Silas died without knowing. What about her? Calder said. What did she inherit? Dora's face did something complicated. Nothing that could be proven. The farm was in Silas's name. When he died, it went to Gideon as next of kin, and Gideon knew about the marriage being invalid. I couldn't say who knew what, Dora said, which was as much as a careful woman in a small town would give him. Calder thanked her and walked back to his horse, feeling like he'd stepped through a floor he'd thought was solid. He thought about it that night, and the next morning over coffee, and on a long ride to check the south fence line, and what he kept coming back to was the simplest version of the arithmetic. A woman had worked on a farm for 3 years. Unpaid or nearly so, and the mechanism that kept her there was not a lock or a threat, but something worse. The fact that her reputation was the only thing she had left, and the truth about her marriage would ruin it. Gideon hadn't needed to threaten her. He just needed to let her understand the situation. The door, as he would say, was right there. On Thursday, Calder rode out to the Bramwell property in the afternoon, an hour before the early spring dark came down. He told himself he had a reason for it. He'd heard that Gideon's east pasture abutted his own property line in a way that needed clarifying before spring. That was true. It was also not the reason he was riding out there. Maren was splitting wood near the south end of the house when he came up the lane. She had a technique that was mostly mechanical set, swing, step back, set again, that said she'd done it enough times that her body had learned to handle it without asking her mind for help. She heard him and looked up. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Calder," he said. She set the axe against the block and waited, not unfriendly but not performing anything either. "I was coming to see Gideon," he said. "He's in town." She looked at him steadily. "Won't be back until dark." "Ah, he didn't move to leave." She waited another moment and then said, "Is there something else?" There were about 15 things he wanted to ask her, and exactly none of them were his business. He picked the one that was most directly his business and said, "I understand the east pasture boundary is somewhere around the 3rd marker from the creek. I was wondering if you knew where that line actually runs." "About 40 feet past where Gideon told you it is," she said. He blinked. "Pardon?" "He moved the marker 2 falls ago. She said it without particular heat, just as a fact she had observed and filed away. The original line is cut into the live oak on the north end. You can read it if you know what you're looking for. He stared at her. How do you know that? Because I was there when Silas marked it 12 years ago. She picked up the axe again. Before he died, he showed me everything on this property. Every line, every water claim, every agreement. I think he knew I'd need to know it someday. She said that last part quietly. Not to herself exactly, but not quite to him either. Do you have documentation of the original line? He said. Yes, she said. He waited for more, and she didn't give it. She set another log on the block. Miss Dallow, it's complicated, she said, and swung the axe. The log split clean and both halves fell away. The documentation exists. Using it would require explaining how I have it, and explaining how I have it would require explaining the rest of it. And the rest of it is, she stopped, set another log. Complicated. He understood then what she was telling him. Not all of it, not the full shape of it, but enough. She was holding information that could help herself and possibly others, and she couldn't use it without pulling the pin on something that would take her down along with everything else. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it plainly, without elaborate apology, the way she spoke. She looked at him over her shoulder. You didn't do anything. No, he said. I know. I'm sorry anyway. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way people don't usually let themselves look at someone they've just met, and then she turned back to the wood. The boundary oak is a white oak, she said, about 200 yards north of the third marker. You'll see the cut if you look for it. He thanked her and turned his horse. He was halfway down the lane when she called after him, not loudly, just enough to carry. The children need paper. If you have any to spare from the ranch. He turned in the saddle. She hadn't looked up from her work. I'll have some sent over, he said. She nodded, and that was the end of it. He sent the paper the next morning, 2 full reams of it, with a note that said only for the school. He signed his name and then thought about it, and crossed out his name and left the note unsigned, because attaching his name to it felt like making it about him in a way he didn't want. That was Friday. On Friday evening, he had dinner at the Harrowell house. Lenora sat across from him, looking exactly as she always looked, composed, well-dressed, in command of her table, and they talked about the spring water situation, about the grazing rotation, about a man from Denver who had come through offering to buy half the basin at prices that sounded good until you read the terms. Lenora had read the terms and declined. Calder had done the same. It was one of the things he genuinely respected about her. She did her homework. Her brother Harlan was at the table too, which Calder had not been expecting. Harlan was 26 and had the particular restlessness of a man who'd been given enough money not to have to work without being given enough sense to know what to do with the hours. He talked too much and listened too little, and Calder had never warmed to him, which he'd filed away as a personal failing he needed to manage. Harlan talked throughout the meal about a land opportunity he wouldn't specify, something about a spring claim that had been overlooked, something about documentation that needed to be filed before the season. Lenora kept her eyes on her plate during this and changed the subject when she could. Calder watched her change the subject and filed that away too. After dinner, riding home in the cold dark, he thought about Maren's words. The documentation exists. Using it would require explaining how I have it. He thought about Lenora's face when Harlan talked about the spring claim. He thought about the land hearing that had been quietly scheduled for June, which Arlen Cope had mentioned in passing the previous week. He thought about the way Red Willow Basin talked about honor and land rights and being decent folk, and how many things it chose not to see. The cattle gathering Calder hosted every spring was the biggest social event on his property all year. It had been his father's tradition, and one of the few things he'd kept, because it served a real purpose. Neighbors needed to meet before the summer spread them across the basin, needed to talk through the season's concerns, needed to eat at the same table, and remember they were going to need each other before it was over. He prepared for it the way he always did. He had the yard cleared, woodcut, the long tables set out. He hired 2 women from town to help with the cooking. And then at 7 in the morning, when he came out of the house to check the preparations, he found that Gideon Bramwell had brought Maren. Not as a guest. She was at the fire with the 2 hired women, and it was immediately clear that she was doing the hardest and least visible work. The carrying, the heaving, the constant resetting of things that needed constant resetting. The two hired women had introduced themselves when they arrived, and had told him their names, and had each accepted a cup of coffee before starting work. Maren was already at the fire when he came out and had not introduced herself to anyone. He didn't say anything yet. He stood and watched the preparations take shape, and watched Maren move through the yard in the particular way he had now seen enough times to recognize through the spaces between people, carrying what needed carrying, setting down what needed setting down, not taking up space she hadn't been given. The gathering filled in through the morning. By noon there were 40, maybe 50 people. The tables were crowded. The conversations were the comfortable conversations of people who knew each other, the seasonal stories, the complaints about weather, the careful negotiations that happened over food. A group of men talked about the land hearing near the fence line. Two older women compared notes on a difficult birth that had happened at the Greer property 2 weeks ago. Children ran in circles between the adults' legs. Maren served the tables. Not one of the 50 people gathered offered her a plate. He watched this for 2 hours. He watched her refill things and clear things, and bring more bread from the fire, and pour more water from the bucket, and do it all with the same careful absence present enough to do the work, invisible enough not to require acknowledging. He ate his own food standing near the fence, which he usually did because it let him talk to people more easily, moving from group to group. And while he stood there, he did the arithmetic he had been doing in pieces for weeks. Here was the basin. Here were its values, its pride, its sense of itself, as a community of honest people who looked out for their own. Here was a woman who had worked unpaid for 3 years, who had taught other people's children their letters before dawn, who had information that could prevent a land fraud and could not use it without destroying herself, and who was at this moment carrying a pot of beans across a yard full of people who were talking about what good neighbors they were to each other. Calder set down his plate. He walked across the yard. He walked past 2 conversations and around 3 children and through the gap between 2 long tables, and he reached Maren at the fire and held out his hand and said, "Give me that." She looked up at him. She was holding the serving knife, the long one used to cut the cornbread. "Pardon," she said. "The knife," he said. "Give it to me." Her face went careful, the way it went when she was recalculating quickly. Around them, conversations were beginning to notice, the way conversations always notice when something changes in the room. "I'm in the middle of," she started. "You've been in the middle of it for 6 hours," he said. He held his hand out. "Sit down." She didn't move. He lowered his voice, not to be private, but to be direct. "There's a seat at the first table. Sit in it. I'll cut the cornbread." "Mr. Voss, I don't think—" "Calder," he said, "and I'm not asking." Something moved across her face that he couldn't read. Not gratitude, not exactly, and not relief either. Something more complicated than both. Then she put the serving knife in his hand and walked to the first table and sat down. The yard went quiet enough that he could hear the fire. He stood at the fire and cut the cornbread and didn't look up. Around him, the conversations restarted, hesitant at first, then gathering back into themselves. From across the table, he saw Gideon Bramwell watching Maren with a flat and unreadable expression. He saw Maren Harrowell watching from near the fence with something that looked like calculation. He saw Lenora sitting 3 places down from Maren, watching her with something he couldn't name at all. Maren sat at the first table and ate her food. She ate it without apology and without making a performance of it either, and when one of the children ran up and grabbed at her arm, she helped him find his mother without getting up from the table, which was the kind of practical efficiency that spoke to someone who had spent years solving other people's problems with whatever reach was available. Calder cut the cornbread and passed it to whoever needed it, and told himself he had done a simple thing that had been too long undone. But he knew, standing at that fire, in the cold spring air with a borrowed serving knife in his hand and 50 people around him who were carefully not looking at what had just happened, that nothing about what he'd just done was simple. He had made a public statement in a community where public statements became permanent. He had declared, in front of every rancher and neighbor, and witness in Red Willow Basin, that the woman who had been invisible for 3 years was worth sitting down for. He had done it without thinking it through, which was the thing he had spent 15 years trying not to do. And standing there at the fire, watching Maren eat her meal at the first table, with the particular dignity of someone who is not going to let the moment become a performance, he found that he did not regret it. Not even slightly. What he found, turning it over as he served the next person who held out a hand for a piece of cornbread, was something he hadn't expected and couldn't fully account for. A feeling that was not at all like the feeling of closing a business arrangement with a woman he respected but didn't know, and very much like the feeling of having, for the first time in a long time, done something that was actually genuinely right. He told himself it was just justice. He told himself that for the rest of the afternoon. The fire burned low. The tables cleared. The sun moved west and the gathering began to break apart the way gatherings do, slowly and then all at once. Maren stayed until the work was done. Of course she did. And when Gideon Bramwell's wagon pulled out of the yard at dusk, with Maren sitting in the back of it, not beside him, in the back, like cargo Calder stood at the fence and watched it go down the lane and thought about a woman who had sat at his table for 1 hour out of her entire time in Red Willow Basin, and what it would take to make sure it wasn't the last time. He didn't have an answer yet, but he had a question. And for Calder Voss, who had spent 15 years trying to manage everything through careful planning and practical arrangements, having a question that pulled at him this hard was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He went inside and did not sleep well, which was not like him, and told himself in the morning that it meant nothing. He knew it meant something. He just didn't know yet what it was going to cost him. He couldn't stop thinking about the wagon. 3 days after the gathering, Calder was mending a section of fence on the north pasture with his ranch hand, a quiet Texan named Burl who had worked for him 7 years and knew better than to talk. When Calder had that particular look on his face, and he was still seeing it, Maren in the back of Gideon's wagon, sitting on a feed sack, her hands in her lap, the same posture she carried everywhere. That refusal to fold even when everything around her was arranged to make folding the easier option. Burl handed him a staple without being asked. "You're doing that fence wrong," Burl said. Calder looked at what he'd done. He'd run the wire on the wrong side of the post. He pulled it loose and did it again. Burl didn't say anything else about it. He knew better. The thing that bothered Calder most, and he'd had 3 days to figure out what bothered him most, was not the unfairness of it, though that was bad enough. It was that everyone in Red Willow Basin had seen exactly what he'd seen and had arrived at a different conclusion. Not a hostile conclusion. Not a cruel one. Just, this is how it is, and it's not my problem, and some people are unlucky, and that's a shame. The kind of conclusion you can live with if you don't look at it directly. He had been living with it, too. He'd ridden past that farm a dozen times over 3 years and never asked a single question about the plainly dressed woman in the yard. Never wondered who she was or what her situation was or why she ate after everyone else at community suppers. He'd been as unseeing as anyone. The difference was that now he'd seen it. And he couldn't figure out how to unsee it. He finished the fence section and stood back and looked at it. "Burl," he said, "you know anything about the Bramwell property? About who has legal claim to what's out there?" Burl took a long time answering, which meant he was deciding how much he actually knew versus how much he was willing to say. "I know Silas Bramwell was a fair man," he said finally. "And I know his brother is a different kind entirely." "The water spring on the southeast corner," Calder said. "You know who filed on that? Silas filed on it. Or so I always heard. And after he died?" Burl looked at him sideways. "That's the kind of question that ends up at a hearing," he said. "Depending on what answers you find." Calder nodded slowly, picked up the wire spool, and moved to the next post. "There's a hearing already scheduled," he said. "June." "I know," Burl said. "Everybody knows. They're just being quiet about it." "Who's making the claim?" Burl was quiet again. "Word is it's coming from the Harrowell side," he said. "Through some deed that turned up recent." He paused. "Very recent." Calder set the wire down and turned and looked at Burl directly. "How recent?" "February," Burl said, "give or take." "February." The month Calder had agreed to court Lenora Harrowell. He turned back to the fence and didn't say anything else, and Burl, who was a wise man, didn't either. That night Calder sat at his desk for an hour, with a blank piece of paper in front of him, and wrote nothing on it. He was trying to think through what he knew in a straight line, without letting any piece of it run ahead of the others, because the straight line mattered here. The straight line was, Maren Harrowell had filed a deed in February, claiming the spring at the Bramwell property. The spring that Silas Bramwell had filed on. The spring whose legal status was now complicated by Silas's death, and the murky question of who had inherited what, given that Gideon had claimed the farm but had possibly not filed properly on the water rights. The spring that Maren Dallow knew everything about, because Silas had shown her everything on the property before he died, because he'd known she would need to know it. And Maren couldn't use what she knew without explaining how she knew it, which would require explaining the rest of it, which would pull down whatever was left of her reputation in a community where reputation was the only currency she had. He sat with that for a long time. Then he went to bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fact that Lenora had not mentioned the spring claim once in all their conversations about the basin's land situation, and that Harlan had talked about it at dinner in the oblique, excited way of someone who is very proud of something he cannot explain fully. He thought about what kind of woman Lenora was, and whether she knew about the claim, and if she knew, why she had said nothing. He was not angry yet, but he was getting there. He got up before dawn and saddled his horse and rode. Not to the Bramwell property, not to High Mesa. He rode to the edge of his own south pasture and sat on his horse in the gray early dark and looked at the basin spread out below him, the rooftops of the town just visible, the Bramwell farm a darker shape against the lighter land. The creek line threading through the spring at the Bramwell's southeast corner that he had never thought much about until 6 days ago. Everything looked the same from up here. That was the trouble with distance. Everything looked orderly and fine. He turned his horse toward town. He found Dora Finch at 7 in the morning, which was the earliest he could decently knock on her door, and she opened it with the expression of a woman who had been up for an hour already and was not surprised to see him. She poured him coffee without asking if he wanted it, and sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited. "I need to understand the full situation with Maren Dallow," he said. "Not the outline. The full thing." Dora looked at her coffee cup. "Why? Because there's a land hearing in June that I think is fraudulent, and I think she's the only person who can prove it. And I think she can't prove it without burning herself down in the process. And I want to understand if there's a way around that." Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There may not be a way around it. Tell me anyway." Dora told him. It took 20 minutes and 2 cups of coffee, and she didn't editorialize, which he respected. The facts were these. Maren had come to the basin in 1881 from Missouri to work as a seamstress and then as a teacher's assistant in a small community school that closed 6 months after she arrived when the funding dried up. She'd met Silas Bramwell at a community dance, and they had begun keeping company, and in the summer of 1883 the traveling minister had come through, and they were married in the same ceremony as other couples from the area. The minister was a man named Carell Brunt, who had claimed ordination from a church organization in Ohio. 2 years later, someone looked into it and found that the organization had no record of Brunt's ordination, and that Brunt himself had not been seen since the summer of '84. The 2 other marriages he'd performed were quickly re-registered properly at the county courthouse. Silas and Maren had meant to do the same and had not, because Silas was sick by then and getting worse, and the courthouse was 40 miles away and the weather was bad, and there was always a reason to wait 1 more week. Silas died in the winter of '85. By then, the invalid marriage had been noted in the county records as uncorrected. The farm went to Gideon as next of kin legal, documented entirely above board. Maren was left with nothing she could prove was hers. Gideon knew, Calder said. It wasn't a question. He found out after Silas died, Dora said. Before that, I don't think it had ever come up. Silas didn't know, I'm fairly sure. He would have fixed it immediately if he had. And instead of letting her go with whatever Silas would have left her. There wasn't much to leave, Dora said, careful. The farm had debts. What there was after the debts was the land and the spring rights. Gideon kept those. He let Maren stay because she was useful, and he let her understand that her best option was to remain useful and be grateful for the roof. Calder set his coffee cup down very carefully, which was something he did when he was working hard to keep his voice level. And the children she's been teaching. The ones who don't have school fees, Dora said. Yes, she started doing it quietly, maybe 18 months ago. In the tack shed first, then sometimes in people's barns if it's too cold. Nobody stopped her because she's not asking anyone for anything. She finds paper and chalk where she can. The families give her what they have, which is usually not money. I sent paper, he said. Dora looked at him. I know, she said. She told me. She said she didn't know who sent it, but she was glad to have it. He absorbed that. The handwriting, he said, on the deed that Harlan filed. You've heard that talked about? I've heard it's a forged deed, Dora said quietly. I don't know who forged it, and I haven't asked, because I'm a doctor's wife and not a land examiner, and getting in the middle of that is not something my husband would thank me for. But Maren might know. Dora looked at him steadily. If Silas showed her everything, she said, then yes. She might know exactly who wrote it and how, and she might have evidence no one else has. But using that evidence requires explaining how she has it, and everything that comes with it. Dora folded her hands on the table. Calder, this is a small place. What she'd be admitting to is that she lived as a wife with a man she was not legally married to. For 2 years. In this community, in 1883, people looked the other way because the marriage appeared legal. But if she stands up in a hearing and admits it wasn't, she let that sit. He understood. The community that had ignored her for 3 years would not go on ignoring her if she made herself visible by confessing. She would become a cautionary story. The children's families would pull them from her teaching. Whatever fragile position she'd built earning house credit for eggs, teaching in borrowed spaces, maintaining the fiction of the respectable widow would collapse entirely. She'd have nothing, he said. She has almost nothing now, Dora said. But yes, it would get worse. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the town was starting its morning sounds, a wagon on the road, someone calling to someone else, the mill starting up at the south end. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Thank you, he said and stood. Calder. Dora stopped him at the door. Be careful what you're planning. I'm not planning anything yet, he said honestly. That's what worries me, she said. He walked out into the morning and stood on the road for a moment. Down the block, he could see Arlen Cope opening the shutters on the general store. 2 women were talking in front of the dry goods shop. A boy was leading a mule with more optimism than the mule shared. None of them were thinking about a woman in a farmhouse 4 miles out, getting up before dawn to make breakfast for a household she was not part of and had never been paid properly to serve. He walked to his horse and rode back to his ranch and spent the next 4 hours doing the work that actually needed, checking the water situation at the north tank, going over the account books, talking to his foreman about the rotation schedule for the spring grazing. He was present for all of it. His mind was elsewhere for most of it. In the afternoon, Lenora Harrowell came to call. This was not unusual. She had been doing it every week or so since February, stopping by under the guise of some basin business or another, staying for coffee, talking through whatever practical matter had presented itself. It was a courtship conducted in the language of land management, which suited them both. Or had suited them both until recently. She arrived at 3 o'clock, which was later than usual, and she looked not quite right. Her composure was intact, but there was something behind it that hadn't been there in February, something tight around her eyes that he recognized as the expression of a person managing information they weren't sure how to manage. He poured the coffee himself, because his housekeeper had gone to her daughter's for the afternoon, and they sat at the table in the kitchen, which was a less formal room than the parlor and one where he found it easier to say things directly. Harlan came to see me this morning, Lenora said, after the preliminary conversation had run out. What did he want? To tell me the hearing is moved up. She held her cup with both hands. To April 28th. Calder set his cup down. That's 6 weeks away. Yes, why is it moved up? Lenora looked at the table. He didn't say exactly. He said the examiner had a slot open and it made sense to take it. She paused. I don't think that's the real reason. What do you think the real reason is? She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he understood she was deciding how much to say. He waited, because rushing this would only make her more careful. I found the deed, she said at last, Harlan's deed. The original, the one he filed. And it's wrong, she said, very quietly, like she was admitting something she'd been holding in for a while. The signature on the water claim, the one transferring the spring rights, it's not Silas Bramwell's signature. It's a very good imitation of it, but I've seen enough of Silas's paperwork over the years to know it's not right. She looked up. Someone forged it. When did you find this out? 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. 3 weeks ago, she had come by, and they had talked about the cattle market and a road repair that the county was delaying, and she had not said a word about a forged deed. He kept his face neutral, but he felt the temperature of his opinion of the situation shifting. Why didn't you tell me, he said. She had the grace not to look away. Because I needed to decide what to do about it, she said. And because I was hoping Harlan would withdraw it on his own. Did you ask him to? Not directly, Lenora. I know, she set her cup down. I know. I thought if I could get him to pull the claim quietly, before the hearing, then it would just go away. Nobody would have to know there was ever a problem. The ranch would be fine, and... She stopped. And you would still have the spring, he said. She flinched, just slightly. The basin rights are complicated, she said. If the claim is legitimate. Is it legitimate? Silence. Is the claim legitimate, Lenora? She looked at the table. No, she said. I don't believe it is. He sat back in his chair and breathed. How far in debt is High Mesa? She looked up sharply. I'm not asking to shame you, he said. I'm asking because the spring claim is a financial solution to a financial problem, and I want to understand the size of the problem. She was still for a long moment. Then she told him. It was worse than he'd imagined, not ruinous, but close. The accumulated result of 2 bad drought years and a cattle disease that had taken a quarter of her herd the previous fall, and a series of repairs on the irrigation system that had cost twice what she'd budgeted. She had managed it, barely, and was managing it still, but barely was doing a lot of work in that sentence. If you'd told me this in February, he started. I know, she said. I might have been able to help. We could have... I didn't want to marry someone's help, she said, and her voice was flat and dignified and honest. I wanted to marry a partner, and then I thought perhaps the spring claim would solve the immediate problem, and Harlan was so certain it would work. She stopped again. I should have said no when he told me about it. I should have said no immediately. But you didn't, no. She looked at him steadily. I didn't. And I'm not going to pretend that I didn't know what I was doing, Calder. I knew it was wrong. I made a bad choice. I've been making it worse every week by not correcting it. He respected that. He did. But it didn't change the situation they were in. There's a woman, he said, who may have evidence that the deed is forged. Lenora went still. Who? Maren Dallow. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read. Recognition, maybe. Or the specific discomfort of someone hearing a name they'd been trying not to think about. She knew Silas, Lenora said carefully. She knew everything about that property, he said. Including the water claim. Including, I think, who wrote the handwriting on that deed. He watched her face. Did you know she was at the gathering last week? I saw her there, Lenora said quietly. Did you know she's been working unpaid at the Bramwell farm for 3 years? Lenora's hands tightened slightly around her cup. I had heard something about her situation, she said. I didn't know the full extent of it. Now you know more, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You want me to withdraw the claim? I want Harlan to withdraw the claim, he said. And I want it done before the April 28th hearing, not after, because once the examiner rules it gets complicated. And if Harlan won't, then things are going to be considerably more difficult for everyone. He said it without threat, just as information. The same way Maren had told him about the boundary marker. Lenora sat with that. He could see her working through it, the ranch, the debts, the reputation, the brother who had made things worse trying to fix them. He didn't push her. He'd said what needed saying. I'll talk to him, she said finally. Soon, he said. Yes. She stood. She was still composed, still the person he'd seen at every meeting and supper for the past 2 months, but there was a different quality to the composure now less like armor, more like effort. Calder, whatever happens with the hearing, I want you to know that I understand if she stopped. Started again. I wouldn't blame you. Let's handle one thing at a time, he said. She left, and he stood at the window and watched her ride out of the yard, and thought that Lenora Harrowell was a more honest person than her recent choices suggested, which made those choices sadder, not more forgivable. He did not know yet what was going to happen at the April hearing. But that evening, without fully planning to, he rode out past the Bramwell farm again. He didn't stop. He rode the road at a walk and looked at the yard as he passed, and saw the light in the kitchen window and the chickens already put up for the night, and the woodpile that had shrunk since the last time he'd looked at it. Maren was in that house, cooking or cleaning or doing whatever was required of her that evening, and she did not know that somewhere at the county examiner's office was a forged deed that could take away the spring that Silas had left behind. The last real thing connected to the man she had believed was her husband. The claim that she alone could prove was fraudulent, and that she alone could not afford to prove. He turned his horse at the end of the road and rode back to his ranch. He had not figured out the way around it yet, but he was going to. He didn't know what it would cost him, and he'd stopped pretending that cost didn't matter. It mattered. Everything about this mattered. He went to sleep that night thinking about handwriting and forged deeds, and a woman who had taught poor children their letters by candlelight in a borrowed shed, and whether the lessons she'd kept might be exactly the thing nobody expected to walk into a hearing room. He didn't know that yet. He was getting there. Outside, the basin was quiet and cold, and the spring at the Bramwell southeast corner ran on, indifferent to the people arguing about who owned it, the way water has always been. And in the farmhouse 4 miles out, Maren Dallow blew out the candle and lay in the dark, and did what she did every night, counted what she had, which was not much, and counted what she knew, which was considerably more, and decided, as she decided every night, that tomorrow she would get up and do it again. She always did. That was the thing about her that nobody in Red Willow Basin had understood yet. She always did. Harlan didn't withdraw the claim. Calder found out on a Wednesday, 8 days after Lenora's visit, when he rode into town for feed, and Arlen Cope handed him the mill receipt and said, without looking up from his ledger, heard the April hearings still on. Harrowell's side didn't pull back. Calder took the receipt. Where'd you hear that? County examiner's clerk came through Monday to post the notice. Arlen nodded toward the board outside his door. It's up on the wall if you want to read it official. Calder went and read it official. April 28th, 9 o'clock, at the county examiner's office in the Basin's small courthouse building. Claimant High Mesa Ranch, represented by Arlen Harrowell. Property in dispute, the Southeast Spring and its associated water rights, currently recorded under the name of Silas W. Bramwell, deceased. He stood on the boardwalk and read it twice and then folded the notice back flat against the wall. Lenora had talked to Harlan. Harlan had not listened. Or Lenora had not pushed hard enough, which was a different problem with the same result. Either way, they were 6 weeks out from a hearing built on a forged deed, and the only person in Red Willow Basin with the knowledge to prove the forgery was a woman who could not prove it without losing everything she had left. He rode to High Mesa that afternoon. Lenora met him in the yard, which told Tim she'd seen him coming and had made a choice about where to have the conversation outside, not in the house, not in the parlor where it would feel like a formal meeting. She was wearing her work clothes, a canvas jacket and riding skirt, and she looked tired in a way that her usual composure had been doing good work to cover. He won't pull it, she said before Calder could open his mouth. I know, he said. I read the notice. She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding herself together. He said the claim is solid. He said I'm letting sentiment interfere with good business sense. He said she stopped. He said a lot of things. None of them were right, and I couldn't make him hear that. What does he think is going to happen at the hearing? He thinks the examiner will look at the deed, confirm the water rights transfer, and rule in our favor. Her jaw tightened. He genuinely believes the forgery won't be detected. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know about the woman, about what she knows. He doesn't know there's anything to find. Does he know you know the deed is forged? Lenora's silence answered that. Lenora. I told him I had concerns about the documentation, she said carefully. I didn't use the word forged. Calder looked at her for a long moment. He was not going to say what he was thinking, which was that a woman who had managed a cattle ranch through 2 droughts and a disease outbreak without losing it entirely was not a woman who failed to find the right word by accident. She had chosen not to say forged because saying it would have required her to decide what to do about it, and she had not been ready to decide. I need to tell you something, he said. All right? I've been looking into the situation more carefully, he said. The woman at the Bramwell farm, Maren Dallow, she may have evidence that the handwriting on that deed belongs to someone specific. Not Silas. Someone who was taught to write in a very particular way that left particular marks. He watched her face. If that's provable, the claim collapses. Lenora went very still. How would she prove it? She kept the children's lessons. 30 months of them. Same handwriting, consistent markers. If whoever forged the deed was one of her students, the lessons are a direct comparison. He paused. But to present them, she'd have to stand up in that hearing room and explain who she is and how she has them. Which means explaining everything. Lenora looked out across the ranch yard. A horse in the paddock moved to the far fence. The wind came across the open land cold and direct. She'd be destroyed, Lenora said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her reputation would be, he said. In this community. Possibly permanently. Another silence. Longer this time. Who did the handwriting? Lenora said. Do you know? I have a suspicion, he said. I'd rather be certain before I say it. She nodded. She was working through something. He could see it. The thing she'd been working through for 3 weeks, maybe longer, getting closer to an edge she'd been avoiding. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to talk to her, he said. To Maren. If she'll talk to me, and if she won't, then I have to find another way in. He picked up his reins. Lenora, whatever happens at that hearing, whatever evidence comes forward, I need you to be ready to tell the truth about what you knew and when you knew it. Her chin came up slightly. That would ruin us. Not necessarily, he said. But staying silent while a fraudulent claim is decided in your favor would ruin you in ways that matter more. He said it as plainly as he could, without cruelty. You're not your brother. Don't let him make you into something you're not. She didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. He turned his horse and rode back down the high mesa lane, and behind him, Lenora Harrowell stood in the yard of her father's ranch and looked at the land she'd been fighting to keep, and thought about the cost of keeping it. He went to the Bramwell farm the next morning. Gideon was in the yard when he arrived, which was bad timing. Gideon had a face that was always arranged in the expression of a man conducting a negotiation, even when he was doing nothing at all. He looked at Calder coming up the lane and stood and waited with his thumbs in his belt. Voss, he said. Gideon. Calder swung down and tied his horse to the fence. I was hoping to speak with Miss Dallow for a few minutes. Gideon's face did something careful. About what? A business matter, Calder said, related to the spring claim. She doesn't have any business, Gideon said. Anything about this farm goes through me. It's not about the farm, Calder said. It's about her specifically. They looked at each other. Gideon was shorter than Calder by 2 inches and heavier by 30 pounds, and he had the solidity of a man who'd spent his life doing physical work and was not easily moved. But Calder had spent his life managing men who didn't want to be managed, and he had learned how to stand in a way that made the conversation feel already decided. 5 minutes, Gideon said finally. She's in the kitchen. Calder went around to the back door and knocked. Maren opened it. She was wiping her hands on her apron. She was always wiping her hands on her apron, and she looked at him with the particular wariness of someone who has learned to be careful about unexpected visits. Mr. Voss, she said. Calder, he said for the 3rd time. Can I come in for a minute? She stepped back and let him in. The kitchen was clean and warm and smelled like coffee and bread, and there was evidence of work everywhere. A pile of mending on the chair, a bucket that needed to go out, a child's copybook open on the table. She moved the mending off the chair without asking him to sit and stood across the table from him. You're here about the hearing, she said. Yes. Gideon told you I know something about it. Gideon didn't tell me anything, he said. You told me. When I came by about the fence line, you said the documentation exists, but using it is complicated. I've been thinking about that ever since. She looked at him. You've been asking around about me. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth, stated plainly. He respected that, too much to deny it. Yes, he said. I talked to Dora Finch. I know the situation with Silas. I know about the marriage and what happened after. He said it as carefully as he could, not to minimize it, but not to make her relive it either, just to establish that he knew so they didn't have to go through the explaining. I'm not here to use any of that against you. Then what are you here to use it for, she said. Direct. No hesitation. I'm trying to figure out if there's a way you can present what you know at the hearing without it costing you everything you have left, he said. I don't know if there is. But I wanted to try to figure it out with you rather than around you, because it's your situation and you deserve to be part of deciding it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out the other chair and sat down across from him, which felt like something. Tell me what you know about the deed, she said. So he told her. The filing date, the claim, the water rights transfer that purported to be signed by Silas but wasn't. He watched her face as he talked. She wasn't surprised. She'd known something was wrong with the spring claim before he'd opened his mouth. He could tell, but she was listening for the specific details, sorting them against what she already knew. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The signature, she said. On the transfer document. Not Silas, he said. No, she agreed. I've seen Silas's signature on everything that went through this farm for 2 years. His S was open at the top. Always. He was taught that way by his father and he never changed it. She looked at the table. The deed they filed. I haven't seen it, but I'd bet money the S is closed. How would you know that? She looked up at him. Because I know who wrote it, she said. And he was my student. And that's how I taught him to make an S. Because that's the proper way. And he learned it so well that he can't write it any other way now, even if he tried. Calder leaned forward slightly. Who? She hesitated. Not long, she'd already decided something when she let him in the door, he realized. She'd been deciding it for a while. Orson Pike, she said. He's 19 now. He was one of my first students 3 winters ago. Smart boy. Picked up handwriting faster than anyone I've ever taught. She paused. He works at the Harrowell ranch. Has for about a year. The room was very quiet. Harlan hired him, Calder said. I assume so, she said. I don't know for certain that Orson knew what he was copying. He was a good boy. Is a good boy. He might have been told it was a legitimate document that just needed transcribing. Or he might have known. She looked at her hands. I don't know which is worse. And your lessons, he said. 30 months of them. You still have them? She was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and went to the back of the kitchen, to the low shelf beside the stove where there were some boxes stacked, and she brought one of the boxes to the table. She set it down and opened it. Inside were papers. A lot of pages of practice letters and copied sentences and short paragraphs written in the careful, effortful handwriting of children, learning to form things properly. They were bundled in groups by student, each bundle tied with something different, a piece of twine for one, a strip of cloth for another, a faded blue ribbon for the largest bundle. She put her hand on the blue ribbon bundle. Orson's, she said. He was my student the longest. Calder looked at the stack. He was not a handwriting expert, but he could see even from where he sat that the letters on the top page had a particular consistency, a specific way of being formed, the kind of thing that comes from careful instruction and becomes permanent. That's your evidence, he said. That's part of it, she said. But I can't walk into a hearing room and put these on the table without explaining where I got them and who I am and what my actual relationship to this farm and this water claim is. She looked at him steadily. You know what that means. I know what people will say, he said. They'll say it loudly, she said. And they won't stop saying it. She leaned back in the chair. I've thought about this, Calder. I've thought about it since the day Silas died, and I realized what my situation was. The thing about being in a position like mine is that you have a lot of time to think, because nobody's asking your opinion on anything, so your mind just works through things. I've worked through this one 100 times, and every version ends the same way, she said. I tell the truth, I save the spring, and I lose the only thing I have left in this place, which is the children and the work I do with them. Her voice was flat and factual. The families will pull them. Whatever goodwill I've built up will evaporate. Gideon will use it as a reason to put me out, and I'll have nowhere to go and no way to get there. He sat with that. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being accurate, which was worse. What if there were something to go to? He said carefully. After. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite kind. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Promise things you don't have the power to deliver, she said. You're not going to fix everything by offering me a position on your ranch or a loan from your accounts or whatever it is you're building up to. I've been offered help before, and help that comes with strings attached is just a different kind of arrangement. I'm not offering you anything yet, he said. I'm asking you what would make it possible for you to do what needs to be done. You're assuming I've decided I'm going to do it. Have you? She looked at the box of papers. The blue ribbon on Orson's bundle was faded almost to gray, but it was still tied in a careful bow, the way she'd tied all of them. She'd kept them that carefully. For 3 years, she'd kept them in a box behind the stove, in someone else's kitchen, in a house she'd never owned, in a life she'd never formally claimed. I have documentation, she said slowly, not just the lessons. Silas had. He kept records of everything. Every water pull, every seasonal measurement, every agreement. He put them in a box and showed me where the box was and told me what everything meant. That box is still here. Gideon doesn't know it exists because he never went looking. She stopped. It has the original water claim filing, Silas's real signature. Dated 1879, before Harlan was old enough to shave. So you have Silas's genuine signature to compare against the forged deed, Calder said. And 30 months of Orson's handwriting to show the examiner where the fake signature actually came from. She looked at him. Yes. Then you have everything you need. I have everything I need to prove the claim is fraudulent, she said. What I don't have is any protection for what comes after. She wasn't asking him to provide it. She was just naming it accurately. When you walk out of a room having told everyone who you really are, there's no taking that back. No, he agreed. There isn't. They sat there for a moment, the kitchen quiet around them, the sound of Gideon moving around outside the back somewhere. The children, she said. The poor ones I've been teaching. If I do this and their families pull them, she stopped. Pressed her lips together. They'll go back to having nothing. No school, no lessons, nothing, and it'll be my fault. He didn't try to tell her that wasn't true. It was partially true, and she knew it. And telling her otherwise would have been the kind of empty comfort that insults the person you're offering it to. What would the basin need to see, he said, to decide that the work you've been doing matters more than the circumstances of how you came to do it? She looked at him like he'd asked the question in a foreign language. Like it was a question she had genuinely never been asked. That's not, she stopped. People don't think that way. Some people do, he said, not enough of them. Maybe enough, he said. If someone made them think about it. She was quiet again. He could hear the shift in her. Not capitulation, nothing like that, but reconsideration. The careful arithmetic she was always doing, shifting its numbers. The paper you sent, she said. The 2 reams, I knew it was you. He said nothing. The unsigned note was a nice thought, she said. But you're the only person in this basin who would have sent 2 full reams and not attached their name to it, because you're the only one who would have thought attaching your name made it about you. She looked at him without much expression. I figured that out in about 10 minutes. He felt something that might have been embarrassment, which was unfamiliar. I just didn't want you to feel obligated, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. She closed the box and set her hands on top of it. I'll think about the hearing. I haven't decided. Fair enough, he said. And Calder, she looked at him. Whatever you're planning to do about your arrangement with the Harrowell woman, do it because it's the right thing. Not because of me. I don't want to be the reason someone makes a decision about their life. He held her gaze. Too late for that, he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she looked away, and he understood that was as much as he was going to get right now, and it was more than enough. He left the kitchen and walked past Gideon without speaking, and mounted his horse and rode back toward town. And somewhere in the middle of the ride, he made a decision that had been building for weeks and had been almost made a dozen times, and was now simply made the way a branch finally breaks. Not dramatically, just completely. He rode to High Mesa. Lenora was inside this time. She met him in the parlor, and she could see from his face that something had shifted, and she had the specific social intelligence to know that this was not a conversation about the hearing. You should sit down, he said. I'd rather stand, she said. He stood too then. Lenora, what we have between us, what we agreed to in February, I think we both know it's not what either of us actually needs. She was very still. Is this about Maren Dallow? It's about what I realized when I saw her sitting at my table, he said. That I have been trying to do the right thing in the wrong way for a long time. Buying a good name instead of building one. And I think you've been doing something similar. He said it without cruelty. You deserve someone who wants to be with you because of you. Not because of what combining our properties would look like. And you want someone else, she said, flat, not a question. I don't know what I want, he said honestly, but I know what this arrangement is, and I know it's not fair to you. She turned away from him and looked out the window at the High Mesa land, her father's land, and he could see the tension in her shoulders and the effort it was taking her to hold herself in the composure she wore like a second skin. He gave her the time. I knew it wasn't right either, she said finally. Her voice was careful. I knew it in February, and I told myself it was enough to respect someone. I think I convinced myself. She turned back. Her eyes were dry, because Lenora Harrowell was not a woman who cried in front of people. I'm devastated, she said plainly. I want you to know that. And I also think you're probably right. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it, she nodded once. Short. The ranch will be in trouble, she said. I know. The hearing if the claim fails. You could survive it, he said. High Mesa on a smaller scale is still High Mesa. You're a better manager than your father was. You know that. She looked at him for a moment. You think very highly of me, she said with something complicated in her voice. I do, he said. I always have. She looked at the window again. I'll tell Harlan to withdraw the claim, she said quietly. He won't, Calder said. Not now. It's too close to the hearing and he's too committed to it. Then I'll tell the truth at the hearing, she said. About what I knew and when. She turned back to him, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen in all their months of careful, practical courtship. Something raw and decided and real. It will hurt. But you're right about what matters more. He didn't say anything. He'd said enough. He rode home in the early dark, the sky going red at the edge of the basin, and he thought about what was coming. The hearing, the truth, the fall of several carefully constructed arrangements, and he found, to his own surprise, that he wasn't afraid of any of it. He was more awake than he'd been in years. The gathering had been 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, more had shifted in Red Willow Basin than in the previous 3 years combined. Most of it hadn't happened visibly yet. It was happening in the way important things usually happen, in kitchens and on horseback and in parlors late in the afternoon, in the conversations that change the structure of things before anyone announces that anything has changed. Maren knew it too. That same evening, after Calder left, she went to the back of the kitchen and got down the box she'd told him about Silas's box. The one with the records and the original water claim, and his real signature dated 1879. And she sat at the kitchen table with Orson Pike's handwriting bundle and the blue ribbon in her hands. And she looked at 30 months of lessons from a boy who had learned to write the way she'd taught him, and had gone and used that skill for something she had never intended to teach him. She sat with it for a long time. Then she tied the ribbon back around the bundle and put the whole thing in the box with Silas's papers and put the lid on and held it on her lap with both hands. She thought about the children who were coming before dawn tomorrow. She thought about the examiner's office and the notice on Arlen Cope's board. She thought about a man who'd walked across a crowded ranch yard and taken a serving knife out of her hand and told her to sit down, and the particular way that had felt. Not like rescue, not entirely. More like someone finally saying out loud a thing that had been true for a long time. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of it in a way that had gotten past the point of fear. She put the box on the table. She was going to sleep on it, she told herself. She was going to be careful and think it through and not make a decision in the dark that she'd have to live with in the morning. But she had already made the decision. She'd made it sometime between the serving knife and the box of papers. Somewhere in that careful arithmetic, her mind was always running. The hearing was April 28th. She had work to do. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the quietest Maren had ever lived through, and that was saying something, because she had lived through some very quiet times. She didn't tell Gideon what she was planning. She thought about it. Thought about whether she owed him a warning, the way you might think about whether you owe something to a man who has kept you fed and housed for 3 years while taking everything else, and she decided she didn't. Gideon had made his calculations about her situation long ago and had never consulted her about any of them. She would extend him the same courtesy. She kept doing the work. She cooked breakfast and hauled water and fed the chickens and split the wood when the pile ran low and mended the things that needed mending. She taught the children before dawn, 3 mornings a week now, because 2 of the families had asked if she could add a day, and she had said yes because she always said yes. She kept the box Silas's box, with the papers and the original claim, and Orson's bundled lessons on top in the back of the kitchen where it had always been, and she did not touch it again until the night before the hearing. What she did instead was think. She had gotten good at thinking over 3 years of doing other people's work. Her hands could cook and clean and carry without her mind, which left her mind free to run through things on its own. She ran through the hearing 100 times. She ran through the moment she would stand up and say her name and what it would look like, the faces in the room, the whispers that would start at the back and work their way forward like a slow fire through dry grass. She ran through it and found each time that she was less afraid than she'd expected. That surprised her. She'd expected to get more frightened as the date approached, the way you get more frightened of a drop when you're standing at the edge of it and looking down. Instead, something else was happening. The closer it got, the more certain she felt. Not confident exactly, just done with the alternative. She had been invisible for 3 years. She had been quiet and careful and useful, and had bent herself around the shape of other people's needs, and she had told herself it was the practical thing, the only safe option, the thing a reasonable woman in her position would do. And it had been all of those things. And it had cost her something she couldn't fully name and didn't want to look at directly, which was the sense that she existed at all as a person who mattered in her own right. She was done with that particular cost. The night before the hearing, she took Silas's box out and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and went through everything methodically. The original water claim from 1879, filed in Silas's careful hand, his signature at the bottom open-topped S, just as she'd told Calder. The seasonal water records, 20 pages of them, dated and measured and noted. The fence line agreements, the grazing notes, the correspondence with the county about the road easement that had never been resolved. A life's worth of careful record-keeping by a man who had understood that documentation was the only protection a small landowner had against the people who wanted what he had. She laid Orson's lesson bundle beside the water claim and looked at them together. The S's were unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Closed at the top, both in Orson's copybook practice and, she was certain, even without having seen the forged deed itself, in whatever signature Harlan had paid him to replicate. Orson had learned that S from her, and she had learned to teach it from a primer that had been very specific about the proper closure of the top loop, and it was as individual as a fingerprint once you knew to look. She tied Orson's bundle back with the blue ribbon and put everything in the box, and put the lid on and set it beside the door where she would not forget it in the morning. Then she sat at the table in the quiet kitchen for a few minutes without doing anything in particular. Gideon and his wife were asleep. The house was still. The farm outside was doing the things farms do at night, small sounds, animal sounds, the wind working at the corner of the roof where a shingle had been loose since October. She thought about Silas. Not for the first time and not the way she usually did, not the grief, which had gone from sharp to dull to something she could mostly ignore, but specifically about the afternoon he'd walked her through every piece of paper in that box and told her what it meant and where it was, and that she would need to know it someday. She had been annoyed at him slightly, she remembered, in the way you're annoyed at someone when they're being practical about the possibility of their own death. She had told him to stop being morbid. He had laughed and kept going, explaining every document in the patient and thorough way he did everything. She was glad he had. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. She was up before the rest of the house, which was always, and she had the stove going and the coffee made. And the morning's work started before she stopped and took off her apron and put on her good dress. It was the dress she'd worn to the last community supper, and the one before that dark blue wool, brushed clean, the only garment she owned that wasn't visibly work-worn. She pinned her hair carefully. She picked up the box. She walked to town. It was 4 miles. She had walked it before. The morning was cold and clear, the sky going pale at the east edge, and she walked at a steady pace without hurrying and without letting herself think too hard about what was waiting at the end of it. She just walked. She got to the courthouse building at 8:45. The hearing was at 9. The room was already half full when she arrived, which told her the word had spread in the way. Word spread in small places, not through any official announcement, but through the particular community instinct for knowing when something significant is about to happen. She recognized most of the faces. Ranchers, townspeople, a few of the farming families from the outer basin. Arlen Cope was there, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed. Dora Finch was seated in the second row with a look of careful neutrality. There were men she didn't know, probably from the county examiner's office, or brought in as witnesses. Gideon was there. He was seated near the side wall, and he saw her walk in with the box under her arm, and his face went through several things very quickly: surprise first, then recognition of what the box probably was, then something that might have been calculation, or might have been genuine alarm. She looked at him long enough to let him know she'd seen him, and then she looked away. Harlan Harrowell was at the front table with a man she didn't know who was probably his legal representation. Harlan looked confident, the specific confidence of someone who has convinced himself that what he's done is actually clever. He had a leather satchel on the table in front of him, and the posture of a man expecting to win. Lenora was seated in the third row, alone. She was wearing a dark jacket, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the table at the front of the room. She looked, Maren thought, like a woman who had made a decision she wasn't sure she could live with and had made it anyway, which was a look Maren recognized. Calder was at the back of the room. He caught her eye when she came in and gave her a small nod, not encouraging exactly, just acknowledging. Present. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated encouragement. She found a seat near the side wall, not at the front, not at the back. She set the box on her lap and folded her hands on top of it and waited. The county examiner was a thin man named Aldous Greer, not related to the Basin Greers. He had clarified at the beginning of every previous hearing anyone could remember, with small, wire-framed glasses, and the manner of someone who found human drama inconvenient and preferred to deal with documents. He came in at 9:03, sat down at the front table, arranged his papers, and called the hearing to order without ceremony. This is a proceeding regarding water rights claim to the Southeast Spring located on property formerly recorded under Silas W. Bramwell, deceased, he said. Claimant is High Mesa Ranch, represented by Harlan Harrowell. He looked up over his glasses. Anyone else appearing as interested party should make themselves known before we begin. Maren did not stand up yet. Harlan's representative, a lawyer named Dubose, who had a voice built for courtrooms and a suit that had been ordered from somewhere with more money than Red Willow Basin, went first. He laid it out cleanly and with some skill, the deed, the chain of title, the water rights transfer that he claimed established High Mesa's claim to the spring. He presented the document with a small flourish that was just this side of theatrical, and the examiner took it and looked at it with the expression of a man trying to decide if it was worth the trouble of looking more carefully. The signature on the transfer, Dubose said, is that of Silas Bramwell, the original claimant who transferred the spring rights to the predecessor organization of High Mesa Ranch in the summer of 1884. The deed has been filed properly, and we request the examiner confirm the transfer and record the spring rights accordingly. The examiner made a note. He looked around the room. Anyone contesting the claim? Maren stood up. She felt the room shift the particular quality of attention that a room gives to something it didn't expect. She saw Gideon's jaw tighten. She saw Harlan's lawyer turn in his chair with an expression of practiced patience that was covering genuine surprise. She saw Harlan himself look at her with an expression she couldn't read, not quite recognition, not quite dismissal. Your name, the examiner said. Maren Dallow, she said. I lived at the Bramwell farm as Silas Bramwell's companion from 1883 until his death in the winter of 1885. I have documentation related to the original water claim that I believe is relevant to this proceeding. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when people are working hard not to make noise. Companion, Dubose said, and put a particular weight on the word that she had been expecting. We believed ourselves to be married, she said. She said it clearly and without lowering her voice. The ceremony was performed by a minister who was later found to have had no legal authority to officiate. We were not aware of this during Silas's lifetime. We intended to correct it. He died before we could. She looked at the examiner, not at Dubose. I'm not here to argue my inheritance. I gave up that argument when I understood the legal situation. I'm here because I have documentation that speaks directly to the validity of the deed you just received. The examiner looked at her. He was a bureaucratic man, not a hostile one. Bring it forward, he said. She walked to the front of the room with the box. She was aware of every eye in the place. She set the box on the edge of the front table and opened it and took out Silas's original water claim, and then she took out Orson's lesson bundle, and then she laid them side by side on the table in front of the examiner. This is the original water rights filing made by Silas Bramwell in 1879, she said. His signature is at the bottom. This is a bundle of penmanship exercises, produced by one of my students over approximately 30 months, beginning in the winter of 1883. She pointed to the S in Silas's genuine signature, then to the S repeated throughout Orson's lessons. The signature on the deed that was just presented to you was not made by Silas Bramwell. The person who made it was taught to write by me, and the particular formation of these letters is specific and identifiable. Dubose was on his feet. The witness is not a handwriting expert. Neither are you, the examiner said mildly, without looking up from the documents. The room made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The examiner looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at the S in Silas's original filing open at the top, tilted slightly right, made in a single unhurried stroke. He looked at the S in Orson's lessons closed at the top, tighter, made by someone who had been taught a specific method and followed it precisely. He looked at Dubose's deed, which he had taken back and was now holding beside Maren's documents. The capital S in the transfer signature, he said slowly, appears to be closed at the top. Dubose said something about the natural variation in a man's handwriting over time. The examiner did not look up from the documents. Maren turned to face the room. She had not planned this part. She had planned the documents and the argument and the explanation. She had not planned what she was about to do, which was simply look at the faces of the people she had lived alongside for 3 years without being truly seen by any of them, and speak. The person who wrote that signature, she said, is in this room. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears. She kept her voice level. I don't believe he was told what the document was. I don't believe he understood what he was helping to do. He was asked to copy something, and he copied it, because he was 19 and working for someone he trusted and needed the money. She looked toward the back of the room where she knew Orson Pike was sitting. She had seen him when she came in. His face pale and young and visibly uncomfortable, in the way of someone who knows the walls are closing and hasn't decided whether to fight them or confess. Orson, she said, you don't have to lie about this anymore. Every head in the room turned. Orson Pike was seated near the back wall, close to the door, in the way of someone who had been considering leaving since the proceedings began. He was thin and dark-haired and looked younger than 19 at the moment, which was very young indeed. He had Harlan Harrowell's name on his wage record and Maren Dallow's handwriting in his hand and the specific paralysis of a person caught between two versions of what he'd done. The version where he'd just been copying papers and the version where he'd known what he was doing and done it anyway. He looked at Maren. She had taught him that closed S. She had corrected his work and praised his improvement and told him once, when he was 12 and frustrated and ready to quit, that his handwriting was the best she'd seen in 3 years of teaching and that he should be proud of it. He had been proud of it. He still was, in the complicated way of being proud of something that had also gotten you into trouble. He started. You don't have to explain everything, she said, more gently than the room probably expected from a woman in her position. Just tell the examiner whether you copied that document. The room waited. Orson looked at Harlan Harrowell, who was looking at his own hands with the expression of a man counting his exits. Orson looked at Maren. He looked at the examiner's desk and the documents laid out on it, and the blue ribbon still tied around his lesson bundle, faded almost to gray but still there. Still the same ribbon she'd tied around it, the last day he had sat in her shed with a piece of chalk and learned to make his letters properly. Yes, he said. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended. I copied it. Mr. Harrowell gave me the document and told me it was an old water agreement that had been damaged and needed transcribing before it could be filed. He told me to copy it as exactly as I could. He stopped. I didn't know it was going into a legal proceedings as an original. The room erupted. Not loudly. It was still a legal proceeding, and people maintained some form, but the noise that came out of 40 people trying to whisper to each other at the same time was considerable. Harlan's lawyer was speaking rapidly in Harlan's ear. Gideon was on his feet, though he hadn't said anything yet. Dora Finch had uncrossed her legs and was sitting forward. Calder, at the back, had not moved. The examiner hammered twice on his table with a flat hand. He didn't have a gavel, and the room settled. "Mr. Harrowell," the examiner said. Harlan looked up from whatever his lawyer had been saying to him. He was 26, and he had the kind of face that photographed as handsome, but was currently doing something much less attractive. "The boy misunderstood the nature of the task," he said. "Did you?" the examiner said, with a flatness that made the question not quite a question. Present to this proceeding a document that was not original, as evidence that it was original. Harlan's lawyer started to speak. "I'm asking your client," the examiner said. "Silence, Mr. Harrowell." Harlan looked at his lawyer, who gave a very small, very controlled shake of his head that said, "Don't answer that." Harlan looked at the examiner. He looked at the room, at the faces of people he had grown up alongside, people who had eaten at his father's table and bought cattle from his family and borrowed tools and returned them. He looked at his sister. Lenora had turned in her seat to look at him. Her face was not angry. It was somehow worse than angry. It was the face of someone who had been hoping, against the evidence, that it would not come to this, and had now run out of hope. "Harlan," she said. "Just his name, just that." Something went out of him. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories. He just chafed slightly, like a man who has been holding himself at a particular tension and has finally decided to stop. "I believe the claim was legitimate," he said, "originally. I believe there was a real agreement. The documentation was harder to find than I expected, and I thought," he stopped. "I thought I was finding a way to save the ranch. I thought I was helping." "By fabricating evidence," the examiner said. No answer. "The claim," the examiner said, "is denied. The water rights remain under the Bramwell estate recording until the questions of inheritance are settled through proper legal channels." He made a note. He looked at Harlan. "I'm referring the matter of document falsification to the county sheriff for review. You may hear from them. You may want to arrange for counsel." He looked at Maren. "Ma'am, your documentation will be retained as part of the record. Thank you for presenting it." He gathered his papers, and that was, efficiently and without additional drama, the end of the formal proceeding. The room did not empty quickly. Rooms never empty quickly after something like that. People moved and talked and looked at each other and processed, the way people do when the thing that they've just witnessed doesn't quite fit the categories they had ready for it. Harlan left almost immediately, his lawyer at his elbow, moving through the room with the specific posture of a man trying to look like he's walking rather than fleeing. He did not look at Maren. He did not look at Lenora. Gideon came through the crowd toward Maren, with his face doing the thing it always did, calculating, arriving somewhere ahead of her. She braced herself. She had known this conversation was coming. "You had no right," he said, low enough that it was technically private, but loud enough that the people immediately around them could hear. "Those papers, whatever Silas kept, that property is mine. Anything on it is mine. The papers were Silas's," she said. "He gave them to me to keep. I kept them. You've been hiding property records from me for 3 years. I've been living in your house for 3 years without wages and without legal standing and without any protection," she said, "and I've said nothing about it. The papers I used today proved a fraud that had nothing to do with your ownership of the farm. The spring rights are still in the estate record, which means they're still yours to file on, properly." She looked at him. "You got what you needed, Gideon. You always do." He stared at her. He wanted to push further, she could see it, but he was in a room full of people who had just watched a woman walk in with a box of papers and dismantle a fraudulent land claim. And the particular arithmetic of public opinion had shifted enough that pushing her here, today, in front of these people, would cost him more than he was willing to spend. He turned and left. Maren let out a breath she had been holding since she'd stood up. She felt Dora Finch's hand on her arm before she heard her. "Sit down," Dora said quietly, "just for a minute." She sat. The chair was hard, and the room was loud, and she was more tired than she'd expected to be. The way you get tired after something you've been bracing for finally happens, and the bracing turns out to have cost more than the thing itself. Dora sat beside her. "You all right?" "I don't know yet," Maren said honestly. "That's fair." Dora handed her a cup of water from somewhere. "You did something very difficult in front of a lot of people who will be talking about it for a long time." "I know. Some of them will talk about it kindly." Maren looked at her. "More than you think," Dora said. "You'd be surprised." Maren wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated that Dora said it without performing it. Across the room, she could see Lenora Harrowell making her way toward the front. The crowd parted for her slightly. She was still Lenora Harrowell, still carried the particular authority of someone who had been important in this community for a long time, but it parted differently than it usually did. Less deferentially, more carefully. Lenora stopped in front of the examiner's table, where he was packing his papers, and asked to speak to him. Maren watched them talk for a few minutes, Lenora's voice too low to hear, the examiner's expression shifting from professional neutrality to something more attentive. Lenora reached into the bag she was carrying and put something on the table. Maren couldn't see what it was from where she sat. Later, much later, she would find out that it was a written statement, prepared the night before, detailing what Lenora had known about the forged deed, and when she had known it, and what she had failed to do about it. It did not help her legally. It was not designed to. It was a voluntary accounting, the kind that serves no practical purpose except to let you look at yourself in the morning without flinching. Maren found out because Dora told her, and when she heard it, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Good," and meant it. The room was thinning. People were finding each other and talking and doing the social work that communities do after something unsettling, reassembling their understanding of things. Maren sat with the empty box on her lap. She'd left the documents with the examiner, as he'd requested, and looked at the blue ribbon in her hands. She'd taken it off Orson's bundle before she handed it over. She didn't know why. Something to hold on to, maybe. Orson was still in the room. He was standing near the far wall, not quite able to leave, not quite able to stay, doing the thing young people do when they have made a serious mistake, and know it, and don't know yet whether they're going to be forgiven for it, or what forgiveness would even look like. She got up and went to him. He saw her coming and straightened up slightly, which was either respect or bracing. "Probably both. Orson," she said, "Miss Dallow." His voice was rough. I want you to know I didn't understand." "I know," she said. "I should have asked more questions." "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She said it plainly, without cruelty and without softening it either. "You're 19. You needed the work. He told you it was legitimate. I understand how that happens." She looked at him. "What you did today took courage. Standing up in that room and telling the truth when lying would have been easier, that matters." He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been prepared to be punished and has received something unexpected instead. His eyes were bright in a way he was trying not to show. "What's going to happen?" he said. "To me?" "I don't know," she said honestly. The examiner referred the matter to the sheriff. "You may be asked to give a formal statement. You should tell exactly what you've told here." She paused. "You didn't know you were committing fraud. That will matter. Whether it matters enough, I can't tell you." He nodded. His jaw worked for a moment. "I still know my letters," he said, which was a strange thing to say and was also exactly right. "You taught me that." "I taught you well," she said. "Use it better from here." He nodded again. He looked like he might say something else and then decided against it. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the windowsill and walked out. She stood where she was for a moment. Calder was waiting near the door. He hadn't pushed through the crowd when the hearing ended, hadn't inserted himself into any of the conversations happening around the room. He'd just waited. She walked toward him and he held the door, and they went out into the cold April morning together. They walked for a little way without talking. The town was doing its normal morning things around them, indifferent to what had just happened 50 yards away, and it was strange to walk through it and feel so fundamentally different from how she'd walked into town 2 hours ago. "Gideon will put me out," she said. Not complaining, just naming it. "Probably," Calder said. "I have one good dress and a box of Silas's papers that I'll need to get back from the examiner, and about enough money in my pocket for 3 days at the eating house." "I know. I don't want to be rescued," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not trying to rescue you. I'm trying to figure out what you actually need, and whether I can help with any of it without making it worse." She glanced at him. "That's a more careful sentence than I expected from you." "I've been working on it," he said. The edge of his mouth moved. "For several weeks." She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost smile, the ease of it, when she'd been carrying that room on her back for 2 hours. "The children," she said. "The families. I need to know if they'll pull them. Some might, he said, at first. When they've had time to think about it, when they realize what you did in there today, I think it'll change. You're optimistic. I'm practical, he said. The basin needs a school. Everybody knows it. Every parent in this valley has wanted their children educated and hasn't had the means or the location or the teacher. You've been being that teacher in a shed before dawn. That fact doesn't change because of what you said in that hearing room today. She was quiet for a moment. I want to petition the county, she said, for a real school, a proper one, but I'd need the community to back it. Lumber, land, money, things I don't have. Start the petition, he said. I'll contribute what I can, but I'll do it after the community does. Not before. It matters that it comes from everyone, not just from one man's checkbook. She stopped walking and looked at him. He stopped too. Why does that matter to you, she said. Because if it's mine, it's a favor, he said. If it's the community's, it's a school. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold and bright, and the street was ordinary around them, and she was standing outside a courthouse with a man she had known for 6 weeks and an empty wooden box under her arm and the blue ribbon of a 19-year-old's lesson bundle in her pocket, and she was homeless and nearly broke and had just told the truth about herself in front of 40 people, and she felt not happy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something lighter than what she'd been carrying. I have some thinking to do, she said. Yes, he said, and some arrangements to make. Yes. And I need to go back to that farm and get my things before Gideon locks the door. I'll come with you, he said, not to help carry, just to be there. She considered that. It was a useful distinction, and he'd made it precisely, which was a thing she was starting to understand about him. He said things precisely when it mattered, even when precision made the thing smaller. All right, she said. They walked back toward the Bramwell farm, side by side in the cold April morning, and behind them Red Willow Basin was already talking, the way it always talked, and some of what it said would be unkind, and some of it would be more generous than she had expected, and all of it would be permanent in the way that public moments always are. She had known that going in. She had gone in anyway. That, she thought, was the thing about finally deciding that being seen was worth the cost of it. You stopped being careful about what people noticed, and you started being careful about what was actually true instead. The blue ribbon was still in her pocket. She kept her hand around it the whole way home. Gideon did not lock the door. He did something worse. He left it open and stood in the yard while she packed, watching with the particular patience of a man who has decided that witnessing the departure is its own form of victory. She had 2 bags. She had owned 2 bags when she arrived at this farm in 1881, and she owned 2 bags now, which said something about 3 years of unpaid work that she didn't need to say out loud. She packed her clothes and her books and the small things that were hers, and nobody else's, a hairbrush, a tin cup she'd bought herself 2 years ago, a letter from her sister in Missouri that she'd read enough times the fold lines were soft as cloth. Calder stood at the fence line, as he'd said he would. Not on the property. Just there. Gideon watched her carry the bags to the gate and said nothing until she was through it. Then, you've made a fool of yourself. She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him, standing in the yard of the farm that had belonged to his brother, that had been worked and documented and cared for by a woman he'd kept like furniture for 3 years, and she thought about everything she could say to him and chose the thing that was most true. I told the truth in a room full of people, she said. Whatever happens next, I did that. She picked up her bags. Goodbye, Gideon. She walked away. He said something else, but she didn't hear it, or she heard it and her mind let it go the way water lets go of a bank it's done with. Calder took the heavier bag without asking. She didn't stop him. They walked back toward town in the afternoon light, and she felt, with each step, slightly more like a person who existed in her own right, rather than in relation to someone else's property. It was a small feeling. It was also not small at all. The eating house in Red Willow Basin was run by a widow named Agnes Pruitt, who had strong opinions about payment schedules and softer opinions about everything else. She gave Maren the room above the kitchen, the warmest one, though Agnes called it the only available one, at a rate that was technically the asking price and practically a favor, and she did it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd made up her mind and didn't see the use of making a speech about it. Breakfast is at 7, Agnes said. Don't bring boots into the hall after 9. "Thank you," Maren said. Agnes waved it off and went back downstairs. Maren set her 2 bags on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. It was small, and the window faced the alley, and the wallpaper had been applied by someone with more ambition than skill. But it was hers. Just hers. Nobody else's name on it. Nobody else's work required to stay in it. She sat there for a while, without doing anything in particular. Then she got out a piece of paper. She still had paper, 2 reams of it. She'd never been profligate with it, and she started writing. She wrote the petition for the school that night. The whole thing, longhand, in the careful, clear script she'd been teaching children to imitate for 3 years. She wrote it as a formal request to the county education office, and she wrote it as a community proposal, and she wrote it as both at once, which was harder than either alone, but more honest than either alone. She stated the need plainly. This many children in the basin, this many years without a proper school, this much educational work being done in borrowed spaces by an uncompensated teacher. She did not apologize for anything. She did not soften the accounting. She finished it near midnight and read it back to herself once and changed 4 words and decided it was done. The next morning she took it to Calder. He read it at his kitchen table while she stood and watched him read, which was a habit she'd developed with students. You could tell more from watching someone read a thing than from asking them what they thought of it. He read slowly, which meant he was actually reading rather than scanning. He turned the page. He went back to the first page once, near the end, to check something. Then he set it down. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her. "You're not asking me to approve it. I'm asking you to be the first name on the community contribution list," she said, "after the other families. Not before. I know what you want," he said. "You told me." He tapped the petition. "How are you going to get the families to sign? After what happened at the hearing, some of them will be." "I'm going to ask them," she said, "in person, at their doors." He leaned back. "Starting when?" "This morning." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you want company?" She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which he could see. "No," she said. "This part needs to be me." He nodded. "Fair." She took the petition and walked out into the town. It was not easy. She had known it would not be easy, and had made the decision to do it anyway. But knowing a thing is hard and doing the hard thing are 2 different experiences, and the body doesn't care how well prepared the mind thinks it is. The first door she knocked on was the Ritter family 3 children, 2 of whom she'd been teaching for 8 months. A father who worked the grain mill and a mother who had once quietly left a jar of honey on the tack shed doorstep for the children's lessons. Mrs. Ritter opened the door and looked at Maren and did not immediately speak, which was information. "I know you've heard what happened at the hearing yesterday," Maren said. She said it first, before anything else, because waiting for it to come up was worse. "I know what people are saying about me. I'm here to ask you to put your name on a petition for a county school, not because of me, but because your children deserve a real classroom and a real teacher and a real future, and those things don't change based on what you think of me personally." A silence. Then Mrs. Ritter said, "Ida came home last week and read me the whole of a letter I'd written to my mother." Out loud, without help. Her voice was flat, but something behind it wasn't flat at all. "She's 7. She's a very good reader," Maren said. "Come in," Mrs. Ritter said. "I'll get my husband." Not every door opened that way. The Callister family ho's eldest boy had been one of her students for 6 months. Let her stand on the porch and told her politely that they needed to think about what was best for their children going forward. She thanked them and left without arguing. The Peel family, whose daughter had not yet been her student but lived less than a mile from where the school needed to be built, listened to the full petition and said they'd think about it, and the way they said it meant probably not. But the Finches signed. The Mill families signed. 3 of the outlying ranching families, when she rode out to them the following day on a horse that Calder had offered, and she'd accepted as a practical matter rather than a gesture, signed without much deliberation at all. Old Arlen Cope at the general store looked at the petition for a long time and then said, "I don't care what your situation was. This basin needs a school," and signed his name in the large, confident hand of a man who has kept ledgers for 20 years. By the end of the first week, she had 19 names. By the end of the second week, she had 31. On the 15th day after the hearing, Lenora Harrowell came to the eating house. Maren was at the small table in her room, going over the petition numbers, when Agnes knocked and said there was a woman downstairs asking for her. She went down and found Lenora standing near the door with a leather folder under her arm, looking the way she always looked, composed, contained, except that the composure was doing visible work today in a way it usually hid. "I'd like to talk," Lenora said. They sat at the corner table in Agnes's empty dining room. Agnes brought coffee she hadn't been asked for and left with the tact of a woman who understood when to disappear. "Harlan has left the territory," Lenora said. "He went to Denver. He says it's for business. I think it's because the sheriff came to talk to him and the conversation was uncomfortable." She held her coffee cup. "He may not come back. I don't know yet." "I'm sorry," Maren said. She meant it partially. The situation was genuinely sorry. Harlan himself she found harder to be sorry for. "The ranch is in trouble," Lenora said. "You already know that. Calder knows that. Half the basin probably knows it." She said it without self-pity, just as fact. "I'm selling the north parcel and the timber rights on the East Ridge. It'll clear the debt and leave me with a smaller operation that I can actually manage without," she stopped, "without needing a fraudulent water claim or a practical marriage to save it." Maren didn't say anything. "I'm also contributing to your school," Lenora said. She opened the leather folder and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a letter of commitment lumber. She had timber rights, and the contribution was specific and substantial. "I want to be on that list," she said. "Not at the top. I'm not trying to buy my way into a good reputation. I know that's not how it works. But I want my name on it." Maren looked at the letter. Then she looked at Lenora. "Why?" "Because what you did at that hearing was harder than anything I've done in 10 years of running a ranch," Lenora said. "And because I sat in that room knowing the deed was false and said nothing when I should have spoken, and my silence made your job harder." She kept her eyes on Maren, steady. "I can't undo that. I can make sure the school has lumber." Maren looked at the letter for another moment. "The Callister family hasn't signed yet," she said. "They're on the fence. If you went to talk to them, not about the school, just a neighbor talking to a neighbor, I think it might help." "You want me to work for it," Lenora said. "I want everyone to work for it," Maren said. "That's the point." Something shifted in Lenora's face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. "All right," she said. The Callisters signed 3 days later. Maren didn't ask what Lenora said to them. The petition went to the county education office on a Tuesday morning in early May, 37 names on it, and a materials commitment that surprised even Maren when she added it up. The county education officer, a woman named Baird, who had been trying to establish basin schools for 4 years and had been met with consistent underfunding and community apathy, read through it twice and then looked up. "You've got enough for a real building," Baird said. "I know," Maren said, "and you want to be the teacher." "I need to sit the examination first," Maren said. "I know that. I want to sit it as soon as it can be arranged." Baird looked at her with the expression of a practical woman, assessing another practical woman. "The next examination is in July in the county seat," she paused. "Your situation. What came out at the hearing? It's been discussed at the office." "I expected it would be," Maren said. "The examination board doesn't have a formal policy on," Baird chose her next words carefully. "On the marital situations of female applicants. Then I'll apply on the basis of my qualifications," Maren said, "which are 3 years of continuous teaching across multiple ages and skill levels with documented results. I'll bring the students' work, if the board would like to see it." Baird looked at her for a moment. "I'll arrange the examination date," she said. The 2 months between the petition acceptance and the July examination were the most useful months Maren had spent in Red Willow Basin, and also some of the most uncomfortable. The community was in the particular state it gets into after something significant people had arranged their opinions and were now in the process of deciding which opinions were final and which were still forming. Some families remained at a distance. Others had come around in the specific, unannounced way of communities that don't like admitting they'd been wrong, but will show it through action, if not through words. Mrs. Ritter stopped her on the road one morning to say that Ida had taught her younger brother the alphabet without being asked, and she thought Maren should know that. An older rancher named Caswell, who had been one of the most pointedly silent people at the hearing, showed up at the eating house one evening and gave Agnes a bag of flour with an attached note that said it was for the school teacher. The note had no signature, but the flour was good quality. She taught through all of it. The children kept coming.
Not all of them, not yet, but enough. And the number was growing rather than shrinking, which told her what she needed to know about where things were heading.
She moved from the tack shed to the back room of the general store when Arlen offered it, which was cleaner and bigger and had 2 proper windows. Calder came by most weeks. He didn't make a ritual of it, and she didn't expect him to. He had a ranch to run and she had work of her own, and neither of them was the kind of person who wanted the other hovering. He came when he had something specific to say, or when she'd sent word about something, and occasionally he came when neither of those things was true and they both pretended there was a reason. One afternoon in June, he brought lumber measurements. The site committee settled on the old Fenwick lot, he said, spreading the paper on Arlen's backroom table. It's level, it's central, and Fenwick deeded it to the community fund 2 years ago when he moved to Pueblo. Nobody's done anything with it. She looked at the measurements. This is bigger than I asked for. You asked for a schoolroom, he said. They built in a second room for when you need it. She looked at him. When, he said, not if. She looked back at the paper. I haven't passed the examination yet. You'll pass it, he said, with the particular certainty of someone who has thought about this rather than just saying it. You can't know that. I know you taught a 7-year-old to read her mother a letter, he said. I know you kept 30 months of lesson records in a box behind a stove for 3 years. I know you walked into a hearing room with a dead man's papers and a faded ribbon and dismantled a land fraud in front of 40 people. He looked at her steadily. You'll pass the examination. She was quiet for a moment. Calder, yes. What is it that you want? She said it directly, the way she said everything. Not from the school. From me. What do you actually want? He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned meant he was finding the right words rather than avoiding the question. I want to sit across the table from you for the rest of my life, he said. Not because it solves anything, or because it combines anything, or because it looks like anything to anyone. Just because there is no one else I'd rather be talking to. She looked at him. He was not a man who made speeches, and that had not been a speech. It had been the specific plain thing he meant, stated in the fewest words that would carry it. She had come to understand that was how he worked, and she had come to find it one of the more reliable things about him. I'm going to pass the examination first, she said. I know, he said, and I'm going to sign my own name to my own contract with the county. I know that too, and then we'll talk. He nodded. He rolled up the lumber measurements and tucked them under his arm and said, I'll see you Thursday, which was when he'd said he'd come by, and left. She stood in the back room of the general store for a moment after he left, looking at the space she was using as a school, the makeshift shelves Arlen had put up, the children's current work tacked to the wall, the light coming through the 2 windows, and she felt something she'd almost forgotten what to call. The feeling of a future that was genuinely hers, built from her own work in her own direction, not inherited and not given and not taken. She went back to work. The examination was on a Thursday in mid-July, in a courthouse room in the county seat that smelled like old paper and was hot from the summer that had settled over the territory with its full weight. There were 6 other women in the room taking the examination, most of them younger than her. The board consisted of 3 men and 1 woman who looked like she'd been sitting on education boards since before Maren was born. The examination took 4 hours. Reading comprehension, arithmetic through long division, basic geography and history, a written exercise in curriculum planning, and a penmanship section that Maren completed in 11 minutes and handed in while other women were still on their second page. She walked out of the county seat on a Thursday afternoon knowing she had passed, because she had taken nothing in that room that she hadn't been doing every morning before dawn for 3 years, and the only difference between what she did in the tack shed and what the board was asking for was that now someone official was watching. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. She was teaching when Agnes brought it up, interrupting the lesson, which Agnes would only do for something important, sliding the envelope through the back door with a look that said she already knew what was in it. Maren told the children to keep practicing their current page and stepped outside. She opened the envelope. She read the letter once quickly and then once slowly. She went back inside and stood in front of the children, 7 of them that morning, ranging from 6 to 12, and said, I've just received my teaching certification from the County Education Board. The 6-year-old, a girl named Bet, who had been her student for 4 months, and who took everything seriously, looked up from her page and said, "Does that mean you're a real teacher now?" "It means the county says so officially," Maren said. "I was already real." Bet considered this and appeared to accept it. The other children went back to their pages. Maren sat down and held the letter in her lap and let herself feel it for a moment, the full weight of it, the years of work behind it. The morning she'd walked into the hearing room with a box under her arm, and the particular terror and clarity of deciding that being seen was worth what it cost. All of it had led here, to a piece of paper with her name on it in a county courthouse's official hand, certifying that Maren Dallow was qualified to teach the children of Red Willow Basin. Her name, her certification, her future. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and finished the lesson. The Red Willow Basin Community School opened in September, in a building that smelled like new wood and had 2 rooms and 4 windows, and a proper door that closed squarely in its frame. The Ritter family donated the school bell. Arlen Cope donated the chalk. Lenora Harrowell's lumber made the walls and the floor and the desks, 12 of them, built by a carpenter from town who charged half his usual rate because, he said, his own children would be sitting at those desks. 23 children showed up on the first day. Maren stood at the front of the room and looked at them. The ones she'd been teaching for months, and the new ones, and the ones whose parents had pulled them away after the hearing and quietly brought them back when the school became real enough that keeping them away felt like punishing the children for the adults' discomfort. She looked at their faces, at the specific quality of attention that children bring to something genuinely new, and she thought that this was what she had been working toward in every dawn lesson in the tax shed, in every egg she'd carried to the general store for household credit she never saw, in every night she'd made herself get up and do it again. Not the building, the faces. "We're going to start with letters," she said. "Some of you know them already, and some of you don't, and that's all right. By the end of this year, everyone in this room is going to be able to read a letter from home. That's the first thing." She picked up the chalk. She taught. 2 weeks after the school opened, on a Saturday morning, she saddled the horse she'd been renting from the livery she could afford it. Now, she had a county salary and rode out to the Voss ranch. It was the first time she had ridden to him, rather than the other direction. She had thought about that, about what it meant to arrive, rather than to receive, and she had decided it meant something she wanted it to mean. Calder's crew was working the south fence when she came up the lane, and 3 of them looked up and watched her ride in, and one of them went to get Calder with the speed of a man who had been told to do exactly that, if this particular thing ever happened. Calder came out from the barn. He had his work clothes on and his hat in his hand, and there was something on his face that she'd seen before. The same thing she'd seen at the cattle gathering when he'd crossed the yard and taken the knife from her hand. That expression of a man who has made a calculation and arrived somewhere. She stopped her horse. He looked up at her. "I have a teaching contract with the county," she said. "My name is on it. My name is on the school deed as the founding teacher of record. I have a salary and a room at Agnes's and 23 students who call me Miss Dallow, and I don't intend to give any of those things up for anything or anyone." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it first, so it's said." "I heard it," he said. Every word. She looked at him from up on the horse for a moment. He looked back at her without rushing her, which was one of the things she had come to count on. Then she said, "Calder Voss, I would like to marry you." His crew, within earshot and making no particular effort to pretend otherwise, went entirely silent. Calder looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been very patient for a very long time and has arrived at the exact place he was willing to wait for. "Yes," he said. "Just that." She dismounted. They were married in October, a small ceremony at the county courthouse, because a courthouse was where official things became real. And the officiating judge was a practical woman named Harker, who read the ceremony without embellishment and asked them both if they were certain, and they both said yes without hesitation, which she appreciated. Dora Finch was there. Agnes Pruitt was there. Lenora Harrowell was there, standing at the back with the careful composure that was now genuinely earned rather than performed. Burl, Calder's longest hand, stood near the door with his hat against his chest and the look of a man who had waited a long time for his employer to make a sensible decision. Orson Pike was there too. He had given a formal statement to the county sheriff and had been required to do community service work 30 days. supervised. Building fence on public land, and had done it without complaint, and had come out the other end of it with the specific sober quality of a young man who has made a serious mistake and been taken seriously about it. He had come to Maren before the ceremony and asked if it was all right that he was there, and she had said yes. And he had said he intended to do something useful with his life, and she had said she intended to hold him to that. She did. Orson Pike went on to work as a surveyor's assistant, and then as a surveyor in his own right, documenting land boundaries across 3 territories, and he became, by his own account, in a letter he sent Maren 20 years later, meticulous about legal documentation to a degree that occasionally annoyed his colleagues and always protected his clients. Lenora Harrowell sold the north parcel and the timber rights and rebuilt High Mesa on a smaller, more honest scale. She never remarried, by her own choice, and she never explained that choice to anyone. She became one of the school's most reliable annual contributors, and she and Maren arrived at something that was not quite friendship, and was considerably more than the awkward mutual tolerance it could easily have been. A working respect between 2 women who understood each other's specific kind of stubbornness. Gideon Bramwell kept the farm. He filed properly on the water rights and kept them. He never acknowledged, in any direct way, what he'd done in keeping Maren working without wages. He did not need to, because Red Willow Basin knew, and knowing changed the way the basin dealt with him. Not dramatically, not through any formal accounting, but in the accumulated small ways that communities have of marking people they've decided about. He lived with that, which was its own form of consequence. Calder's ranch and the school stood on opposite sides of the valley, close enough that on clear mornings you could stand in either yard and see the other building. He never tried to run the school or tell her how to run it. She never tried to run the ranch or tell him how to run it. They had dinner together every night and argued sometimes about things that were genuinely worth arguing about, and they were not perfectly happy, because people are not perfectly anything, but genuinely glad of each other in the particular way that comes from choosing something clearly, rather than arriving at it by default. Their daughter was born 3 years after the ceremony, in the spring. They named her Clara, for no reason other than that it suited her, and Clara suited it, and turned out to be a child with her mother's determination and her father's patience, which was a combination that made her formidable by the time she was 8. One morning when Clara was 5, she reached up before they left for the school and put the blue ribbon in her mother's hair. Maren was in the middle of getting ready and didn't stop her, just let her do it. The small hands, the concentrated effort of a child working at something precise, the ribbon going in crooked and then being fixed. There, Clara said, with the satisfaction of a person who has completed a thing to their own standard. Maren looked in the small mirror on the wall. The ribbon was slightly off-center. She left it. She had kept that ribbon since the day of the hearing because she needed something to hold on to on the walk across town, and it had stayed in her pocket for months after that because she never quite found the moment to put it down. And eventually it had become the kind of thing you keep, not because you made a decision to keep it, but because it has become part of what you carry. It had tied Orson's lessons. It had been in her pocket when the hearing ended. It had crossed the room with her when she walked into a space that hadn't expected her, and it had been there when she walked out of a farm that was not hers and into a life that was. Now her daughter was putting it in her hair on a school morning, with 5-year-old hands and complete confidence that this was the right thing to do. Maren picked up her bag and took Clara's hand and walked out the door. The valley was wide and cold and beginning to show the first green of spring, and the school was across it, with 27 children now who would arrive before she did and wait, because they had learned that she was always there and that waiting for her was worth it. She had made them believe that. That was the thing she hadn't known when she was teaching in the tack shed before dawn, with borrowed chalk and no paper and no certainty that any of it would matter. She'd been trying to give them something. She hadn't understood that in giving it, she was also building the thing she'd been missing. Herself evidence accumulated over hundreds of mornings that she was someone worth showing up for. The basin had overlooked her for 3 years, and she had spent those 3 years quietly proving, in the only language she had available, that she was there. Not rescued, not managed, not absorbed into someone else's story. There, her name, her work, her valley, her daughter's hand in hers on a spring morning. That is the thing communities sometimes forget, and people sometimes forget about themselves. That the woman feeding the chickens before anyone else is awake may be the one who knows exactly where the line runs, and what the records say, and whose handwriting that is, and what the truth costs, and why it is worth the cost anyway. Maren Dallow knew. She always had. She just had to wait for the rest of them to be ready to see it.